how's it going? I'm IlaGolden and welcome to my blog. Alright, so today I want to cover two sort of interlinked topics. The first being mortality and immortality, and the second being the definitions of higher beings, God-class beings, gods and demigods within the multiverse. And I've kind of lumped these two together because there is a lot of the mortality stuff can probably be covered pretty quickly, but you kind of need to know that in order to understand the rest of it. So it's sort of interlinked enough to warrant all being rolled into one nice big ball of information. So we'll cover the whole mortality thing first. There are 6 stages of mortality. This obviously includes the immortality side of things as well. So on your basic level you've got mortals, or mortality, which is just a limited lifespan. So you're born, you exist for X amount of time, and then you die. Because there is a whole afterlife side of things, your death can grant you what is the next level up, which is extended mortality, which is a long but not unlimited lifespan, although at the same time you're more moving from life into the second lifetime that in and of itself can be very limited, or in and of itself can be very long, depending on certain things. And I may have to make that a topic all on its own and just sort of briefly mention it here rather than going into anything else. So as I just mentioned, the next stage after mortality is extended mortality. So creatures and beings that live for a very long time, but ultimately will eventually die. So in the mortality sort of section, the Adreans are mortal, the Sarconians are mortal, the Standings are mortal, most of the enchanted breeds are mortal, although a few of them do have extended mortality. Some of them have extremely short mortality rates as well. And then in your extended mortality, you've definitely got the VSEN and the LG, which will be covered in their own topic at some point. A lot of the demons tend to have extended mortalities, and a lot of the demigods tend to have extended mortalities as well, which, as you can see, is why one of the reasons why they're sort of tied into this section. So after extended mortality, you have what is referred to as the immortal empart. They have essentially gained a form of immortality, but their immortality has a catch to it, in that they need to be connected to somebody else, and as long as, or to many people, it can be just to one person, it can be to many people, or it can even be to an object in some cases, but as long as they are connected to something and that something still exists, then they are immortal. They are impervious to succumbing to mortal wounds or to fluke death or anything like that. They are, as long as their touch item or items or people or person still exists, they will still exist, and they can be connected to many people, and the number isn't limited at all. So essentially, as long as they are connected to someone or something, and that can change, and as long as they are never without a connection, they are immortal. But as soon as they lose that connection or lose all of their connections, then they are vulnerable to mortal death, essentially. So immortal imparts are incredibly interesting, because there is so much that almost can be done to sort of loophole them into a normal state of immortality, because an immortal in part can be strongly connected to an immortal, and therefore shouldn't they be then immortal? No, because their immortality is still dependent on that immortal surviving and remaining immortal, and immortality can be taken away through various means. It's not, just because you're immortal doesn't mean there's no way in hell that you can die. It just means it's incredibly difficult for you to be killed, and it takes a lot in order to, to take that away. So, you can have a group of immortal imparts linked together, and it's their connection to each other that is keeping them immortal, and yeah, their immortality is basically grouped by them all being immortal imparts and all being connected to each other. So there are lots of almost loopholes which allow an immortal impart to gain what is essentially true immortality without actually being truly immortal, because they're still tied to this idea that they have to be connected to these people in some way. And if they lose that connection, they lose the protection of the immortality that they gain through that protection. So there are still, it's an unstable form of immortality. It's the most unstable form of immortality because it does have that huge catch to it, and it's not something you can be born. It is something that you acquire through various different methods, but mostly, I say it's not something you can be born. There are a couple of cases of people being born immortal in part, and that I did forget about that for a moment because 90% of my immortal imparts have the imparted immortality sort of enforced on them through the various things that have kind of happened to them. But at the same time, we can kind of argue, were they born with this potential of being an immortal impart, or was it something that was actually imparted on them? And there's a little bit of room for debate when it comes to my immortal imparts, but for the most part, I sort of see most immortal imparts become immortal imparts and not born immortal imparts, and the few immortal imparts that are born immortal imparts, you could argue gained that imparted immortality through growing up, because you can't necessarily be born with a strong connection to someone, even though sometimes you are born with a strong connection to someone. Damn, my multiverse is complicated. So after your immortal imparts, you've got your immortal mortals, which is basically a mortal whose lifespan has been extended indefinitely, or a mortal who has been granted immortality for one reason or another. Best example I can give of this, for anybody who's watched the vlog on the 10th Order, is that Setu from Setu and Peri has been granted immortality. He is the one they wanted to be the 8th god. He was granted immortality upon his death, so he is a mortal, a mortal who's been granted immortality because they decided that they wanted him to become a god, and one of the prerequisites of being a god rather than a demigod is that you have some form of immortality, which is, as I said, most demigods are extended mortals, or extended mortality, or have an extended mortality, whereas somebody who is classed as an actual god has to have a form of immortality, whether it's imparted immortality, true immortality, immortal immortality, or what I'll come on to in a second, which is mortal immortality. Whichever form of immortality it is, they have to have some form. They can't just have an extended lifespan. It has to be some form of immortality. They have to have some very indefinite lifespan and be incredibly hard to kill in order to get the god rather than demigod classification. You can see why I'm looping these things all together now, can't you? So after your immortal mortals, you have your mortal immortals, which is a much more recent phenomena within the multiverse. It's only happened a few times so far, and anybody who's gotten far enough through the tales has probably come across mortal immortals. Basically, a mortal immortal is anybody born to mortal parents who are playing host to immortal parents for whatever reason, and whose basically their parents are linked to the souls, or are linked somehow, or as I said, playing host to immortal beings for whatever reason and under any circumstance. And as I said, it's only happened a few times in the multiverse so far, so it's not an incredibly common occurrence. But the child is basically seen as having four sets of parents, because they've got their mortal parents and they've got their immortal parents. And it is a combination of all of that power and blood and everything else which has caused this child to be born both mortal and immortal at the same time. It's an odd classification, admittedly, but it's one that kind of separates them from the multiverse in a very unique kind of way, and it's something that does play an important part in the current state of the multiverse. That's as far as I'll go with that, because I could get into a lot of spoiler territory else, and I haven't written half of those stories yet. So your last classification system is your true immortal, and it is what most people consider to be immortality, where you are born immortal, you have an unlimited lifespan, you're an incredibly difficult being to kill, your immortality isn't reliant on anybody else, it hasn't been granted to you by anybody else, it is just what you are. That is not to say that, you know, as I said before, there is no being that can't be killed or destroyed in some way, but the true immortals, they do have the ability to regroup themselves, even if they've been destroyed. It is very, very difficult to actually 100% wipe them out with no hope of them ever returning. That is kind of the very definition of the true immortals, and it's the one thing that does set them apart from all the other immortal classes, is that no matter how much you destroy them, they still have a chance of regrouping and reforming and coming back again. And again, anybody who's read the tales will have some idea as to what that might involve. Can you see? I'm trying to get you all to read the tales. Love that book so much. Okay, so we've covered the stages of mortality quite quickly. Well, actually took a little longer than I thought it would, but never mind. And as you can see, I sort of started, you know, mentioning how it sort of links together to the other thing that I want to talk about, which is the definitions of high beings, god class beings, gods and demigods. So the first one I will cover very quickly, which is the difference between a god and a demigod. To be either, you need to be worshipped, and this is something that I covered in the 10th Order, is that in order to be a god within the multiverse, the general population, or a general population, or enough people have to agree that you are a god and that you are worthy of being worshipped for you to be classed as a god, or a demigod. Although if you're being worshipped, then to the people worshipping you, you are a god rather than a demigod, but to people who have a different set of beliefs, then you are seen as a demigod, and this is where I'll get into the distinction between the two. Demigods tend to have extended mortality, whereas gods have some form of immortality, and that is the difference. So if you're somebody worshipping a demigod to another religion, but they are I'll do this a little bit better. If you're somebody who has decided that somebody with extended mortality is your god, they in your religion are a god. They are classed as being a god to you, therefore they are a god. But to somebody worshipping a different religion, that is a demigod. Because they don't have a form of immortality, and that is just the key difference within the multiverse. And I know demigod means something different in our world, but in the multiverse, difference between a demigod and a god is immortality. A demigod has extended mortality, whereas a god has some form of immortality. It doesn't have to be true immortality, just some form of immortality in order to be classed as such. And the group of particular demigods that I do think of usually, or my go-to when I'm talking about demigods in my multiverse, are the McTay clan, who actually do have 7 true gods, and the rest of the clan are demigods. I will talk more about them in another vlog. They deserve their own vlog very much, but essentially they are led by their 6, 7 true gods, and everyone else is a demigod, and even a little bit within the people who are worshipping the McTay clan do view the others as being demigods. And certainly if you're of another religion, you're viewing the general population of the McTay clan as being demigods. Whereas, you know, there's sort of a borderline. You're worshipping the clan as a whole, therefore to you they are as a whole a set of gods. Whereas to, yeah, you get sort of gist of what I'm saying, right? So yeah, that's covering gods and demigods quite nicely. As I said, what makes them is the fact that they are worshipped. The general population have to decide that they are worthy of being gods in order for them to be gods. And then the difference is a demigod has extended mortality, whereas a god has some form of immortality. So, switching on to high beings and god class beings. High beings tend to refer to immortal beings that aren't being worshipped as gods. That's not necessarily to say that they aren't some form of deity or being recognised in some sort of way. A lot of them are, a lot of them aren't. At the same time, there are a few higher beings that don't have some form of immortality as such. So I guess higher beings sort of also covers the extended mortality beings that could be worshipped as some sort of god but aren't. Yeah, essentially. Although I will get on to how that differs from god class in a second, I'm sure. Now, the interesting thing with the high being classification is that the most powerful high beings are actually the mistresses themselves, which, as I'm sure those of you who have watched the vlog on the origin of the multiverse will be scratching their head and going, why aren't they gods? They should be. By all right, they should be. They are the original creators of the multiverse, but they decided they didn't want to have that. After everything they went through, they decided they didn't really want to have that sort of responsibility, and managed to sort of manipulate the Adrian population into supporting their children and the gods of the 10th Order over them, thereby negating their own godship and reclassifying themselves as high beings. That's not to say that there aren't those who do try to worship them and do try to reinstate their godhood. They are resistant to wanting it back. So it is one of those very odd situations where they are and they aren't gods. They are either the most powerful higher beings or they are the original gods. And it does very much depend on your point of view and which religion within the multiverse you're coming at it from. Whereas the lowest form of high beings are the nether heron, and again, they probably need their own vlog, either looped in with the VSEN and the LGs or on their own. We'll see. But again, they have extended mortality. Debatably, they have extended mortality. The idea being that most mortals are born love it when I get tongue-tied, are born with a purpose, and they will exist until that purpose has been fulfilled, whatever that purpose might be. And for some people that's something they can fulfill whilst they are alive, and for other people that is something they fulfill once they are deceased. And all mortals, when they become deceased, become nether heron, which is why it's referred to as an extended mortality state, even though technically speaking the nether heron have the most unstable length of extended mortality of all the extended immortals, or all the extended mortals, sorry. And that is literally because they could accomplish that thing very quickly, or it could take them a very long time to accomplish that thing. And you know, if they've managed to accomplish that thing before they've died, then they're not guaranteed any length of time at all. They might get a few years, they might get, you know, a few, you know, decades. But if they've accomplished whatever it is they're supposed to accomplish before they've died, then their extended mortality probably isn't going to be very long at all. And then they'll turn to the light and then be reborn. So it's, you know, how you look at it. How you look at it, really. And everything in between those two things, so everything in between the mistresses at the top of the chart, who are definitely immortals, and true immortals at that, and very powerful, and then down at the bottom of the chart you've got the extended mortality of the nether heron, and then you've got everything in between, who are not being classed as being gods, who may or may not be being worshipped, that make up the that make up the high being classification. And it is a huge, probably there's more things that go into the high being classification than go into any other classification, because it's all how you look at it. And you know, one person's thing that might be worth acknowledging is completely not worth acknowledging to other people. It's like the McTays themselves might have fallen into the high being classification, as in, you know, the 6 true McTays, 6 true McTays plus 1 extra. They might have fallen into the high being classification if certain things hadn't happened, and again I will cover them properly in their own because they're very interesting and I like to talk about them. Yeah, so that covers the high being classification, and it's probably the most confusing classification to talk about, but you kind of get a bit more of an idea, I hope. So the last classification is the God class, and this is purely to do with power. So you can be a god and a god class being. You can be a demigod and a god class being. You can be a high being and a god class being. You can be a mortal and a god class being, because god class simply refers to your power level. If you have the power of or equivalent to or higher than a known god, that is seen as being, you know, a true god rather than a demigod, then you are a god class being. You know, if your power level is all the way up here, you're a god class being. Most god class beings do have some form of either extended mortality or actual mortality, because you can't really get to that level of power without somehow acquiring some extension to your lifespan, be it extended or indefinitely or not. But yeah, God. When I'm referring to God class beings, I'm not excluding gods necessarily. I'm simply talking about power levels. Although most of the time, I will either say God or God class being, and I will make a distinction that when I'm talking about the God class beings, it's usually somebody who's not being worshipped as a god. Not necessarily not being worshipped as a god, but they're less likely to be being worshipped as a god. Then, if I'm saying they're a god, then that's probably because they're being worshipped. So mostly when I'm talking about God class beings, I'm talking about the groups that aren't being worshipped, but technically speaking, gods themselves are God class beings. The God class beings simply refer to your power classification, and that is the easiest, most simplest of explanations ever. Everything else is complicated compared to that, apparently. And just from doing this one alone, I have several great vlogs that I know that I can do in the future to obviously cover this a little bit better and a little bit more precisely, because this has just been a general sort of overhaul, but you can sort of see why these things kind of go together. You can't really talk about levels of immortality and not know what immortality, or not have explained what the levels of mortality and immortality are, and you can't talk about those things without sort of acknowledging like the God class beings and the higher beings and stuff, and not really give an explanation to what you mean by them. So in short, there are 6 levels of mortality: mortal, extended mortality, immortal in part, immortal mortal, mortal immortal, and true immortals. And then you've got your demigods and your gods, who are those things because they are worshipped, and your demigods are usually extended mortals, or occasionally normal mortals, but we'll just say they're all extended mortals for now. And your gods have some form of immortality. And you've got your high beings, which are any beings that have extended mortality upwards, who are acknowledged as being sort of important but not necessarily worshipped. And they range from the mistresses at the top of the chart to the nether heron at the bottom of the chart. And there are lots of stuff in that group, and you'll probably be hearing the classification of higher beings used quite a lot from here on out for various things. And then you've got God class, or God class beings, which is simply referring to power level. So any being that has the level equivalent to or higher than a god is a God class being, and they can have any level of mortality. They don't necessarily need to be worshipped, but if they are worshipped, then they are definitely gods. Okay, this was fun. Hopefully coherent, definitely fun. So, I have so many choices now as to what the next vlog could be about. And I think originally, kind of in my head, went, I'd quite like for it to be about the McTay, and I do quite want it to be about the McTay for the next one still. However, when I was looking for the levels of mortality in my multiverse canon, and as you can see I keep glancing towards it because it is, once again, it's right there for me. I did remember that I do want to talk about Gaia and the Gaians a little bit more in depth, and I think I do need to cover them first. So I think the next 2 vlogs will be, the next one will be about the Gaians and Gaia, and the following one will be about the McTay, because reasons. I hope you've enjoyed this one as much as I've kind of found myself enjoying this one. I hope it's been interesting for you. I hope you come back again for the next one, and until you do, see ya!